Alright guys, welcome back to another tutorial. We're going to be covering cell respiration. This is your third tutorial in Unit 3. To be honest with you guys, this is a pretty hard section. It's definitely the hardest thing that you're going to cover in high school biology because not only do you have to memorize it, you have to understand it. And it's quite a bit to memorize and it's quite a bit to understand. I actually had a lot of trouble with this. Trouble remembering this. I guess I didn't really have a problem when I studied it, but if you were to ask me about this process today, I would struggle through a little bit. It would take me a couple of minutes to remember all the steps. So don't feel bad if you're having trouble with this. I'll probably do an end of chapter summary towards the end of this video in case, just to help you guys out with a mastery test. But it is going to be a pretty long video, so I'm guessing around the last 10 minutes I'll do an end of chapter summary, and the rest of this, and I'm thinking this could be a 30-40 minute video, not including the summary, we'll cover all the ideas and principles. And you'll notice that I've already actually done this before. It's just that I messed up my drawing. I wanted to teach it a little differently. So the main problem with this lesson is how I'm going to teach it to you. It's not really 100% hard. It's a very unusual lesson, and a lot of people have trouble with it. So I'm trying to come up with a different way to do it. All right. So we're talking about cell respiration, and cell respiration is a process that animals and humans obviously use in order to produce energy. You can think of this as like photosynthesis, but in animals. Okay, and we produce ATP. Now to produce this ATP, we actually have 3 steps. So let's pretend we have a giant cell. Alright, there's your cell. And obviously you're going to have a nucleus and endoplasmic reticulum, all that jazz. We're going to focus on just one organelle for now. This is going to be our mitochondria. Okay, so it has a double-layered membrane. I'm going to draw that double layer. And then it has all sorts of little folds in it. Great. Alright, so here's our mitochondria. This outside of here is called our cytosol. Cytosol is essentially the blood of a cell. It's just that weird jelly stuff that fills a cell and keeps everything sort of in place. Alright? But in this cytosol, you're going to have this process called glycolysis. Glycolysis. Alright? And glycolysis is going to be the first step of everything. This is the first step. It happens every time we produce energy. Alright? It produces 2 ATP. That's what glycolysis is. Alright, glycolysis is step 1. So we get 2 ATP out of it. Alright, you know what? I should probably draw it like this. 2 ATP from step 1. Alright, second step that we're going to have is called the Krebs cycle. Now that we've gotten in glycolysis, and this is going to be the big first process that needs a lot of space, our second process is going to be Krebs cycle. Alright, so we're going to write Krebs in here. This also creates 2 ATP. This is, however, an anaerobic process. And we're going to talk about all that means in a little while. I just want you guys to see the 3 and where they are right now. Like I said, we'll cover all this in detail. And then over here at the end, you're going to get something called the electron transport chain, or the ETC. It is also called oxidative phosphorylation, but it looks like your tutorial is only going to use ETC, so I'm going to use ETC. Alright, and this produces a whole lot of ATP. It's about 32-ish. So let's go with 32. Alright, so you'll notice that the first step only creates 2 ATP, second step creates 2 ATP. This last step is the most important. And it's also going to be the only aerobic one. This one can only happen in the presence of oxygen. So when you're breathing properly, you can create a lot of ATP, a lot of energy, right? But if you're not breathing properly, you have to stop at these 2 steps. And normally end up with 4 ATP. That's why you end up with things like cramps and whatnot. Because if you get enough oxygen, you're going to produce enough energy. But if you don't get enough oxygen, you only are left with these 2. So you have to work like a million times harder. Alright? Technically like 8 times harder, but still you get the idea. So let's go ahead and move on. Let's see what they talk about specifically throughout this tutorial. I'm on page 5, and it's talking about glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis is going to be the first process. Let's talk about glycolysis. So I told you guys this was step 1. It is going to happen no matter what. So whether or not there's oxygen, we're going to do glycolysis inside of our cells. Alright, glycolysis is at step 1. And what you're going to do is you're going to start with just glucose. So remember, cell respiration is like the opposite of photosynthesis, right? And one thing plants create is that glucose, or that sugar. that food. So we eat food, we eat animals and plants and whatnot, and we get this glucose. And this glucose breaks down into two things. It's going to break down into 2 ATP. So here's that ATP that we talked about, and 2 ADP. ADP, by the way, is adenosine diphosphate. Adenosine. I'm not going to write phosphate, but di. Di means 2, okay? So T is tri, di means 2. You end up with 2 triphosphates and 2 diphosphates, alright? You're also going to end up with, you're going to end up in these, oh my gosh, this is a very strange drawing they've got for you on page 5. So I'm going to break it down in words. You're going to do this ATP process several times, and you're going to end up creating 4 ATP. Okay, so do I even want to go over this? You know what? I've got a better way to explain this. Glycolysis, alright? It costs 2 ATP to work. It results in 4 ATP. Alright, so you end up with 4 ATP molecules with a net gain of 2. So here's how this works. When you do glycolysis, it's going to cost you 2 ATP to start it. So if you have 0 energy, you can't do this. That means you're dead. Okay? But as long as you have energy, you can get this to work. As soon as glycolysis starts, it creates 4 ATP. But you used up 2 of them earlier, which means overall you're only gaining 2 ATP per glycolysis cycle. Alright? I'm not going to worry too much about all the other specifics, but glycolysis releases 2 ATP. Alright? The reason that this works, whether or not it's aerobic or anaerobic, so remember aerobic, you've probably heard of aerobic exercise, it just means with oxygen, okay, so I'm going to abbreviate that O2, but anaerobic, remember what that AN prefix means? So anaerobic, it just means not, so it is without oxygen essentially, or not with oxygen, so without oxygen. Alright, so the reason glycolysis works both aerobically and anaerobically is because it borrows from something called NADH. And this process is going to show up in our next step. So what you'll notice is that let's say you run out of air, this thing still keeps going because of what happens in the next step. The next step is going to release some of these. We're going to recycle that back up to the top, do this process again, get more of these, and recycle it. Alright, so it's a perpetual energy machine, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to page 6. Alright, so page 6 is going to cover the Krebs cycle. Alright, Krebs cycle is going to be the second step. So remember over here, I drew it. Krebs cycle is step 2 over here. Alright, it also produces 2 ATP, but this one is going to be the first step that happens inside of the mitochondrial membrane. Alright, so this is a big deal. It happens inside of the mitochondrial membrane. Now, this Krebs cycle, so let me cut off this paper, move this up. Krebs cycle. What's going to happen is during the glycolysis, you end up with something called pyruvate. Krebs cycle is going to use pyruvate. So here's pyruvate. Krebs cycle is going to use pyruvate in order to create a little bit more energy. It's going to break down pyruvate into a couple of different things, including NADH from earlier on. Alright, so you're going to end up with Krebs cycle, you have pyruvate, it's going to break down into a bunch of things, so I actually need a little more of this. But anyway, you got NAD, you're going to get the NADH, which we talked about earlier, you're going to end up with some hydrogens, you're going to end up with CO2, quite a bit of that actually, and you're going to get what's called acetyl coenzyme A, so coenzyme A. Alright, this is all one gigantic process to create your ATP that you need. It's going to go through a process that's very cyclical. Just like everything else is going to work in a circle, but this pyruvate is going to break into a bunch of different things, and you're going to end up with 2 ATP and then a bunch of byproducts like NADH and coenzyme A. Both of these are probably the most important of the byproducts. You don't really need to worry about. Obviously, we breathe out CO2, so you're going to lose CO2 in this process anyway. You guys know that cellular respiration, human beings breathe out CO2. This is part of the reason why we breathe out CO2. All right, it comes out in a lot of different other ways, but we're probably most concerned with coenzyme A and NADH. So you end up with 2 ATP from Krebs cycle. Let's go ahead and move on from Krebs cycle. Let's go into our last one, the electron transport chain. Like I said, it has other names, but I'm going to go with the one that they use in your tutorial. So electron transport chain, or ETC. This is where the most energy is. Okay, so this is the most energy. This is actually a really important part of the steps. Without this step, you're pretty much inefficient as a human being. There's no way we'd be able to do the things that we do if we didn't do ETC. But this is an aerobic only process. Aerobic only. And it only happens in the presence of oxygen. Hold on one sec. Okay, so the idea of the Krebs cycle is you go from the Krebs cycle, you create all this stuff, that 2 ATP and whatnot, and you move the rest of it down here. So all this stuff, you know, the coenzyme A, the NAD, NADH, all that jazz, it's going to move here to the ETC. And now the ETC is going to be what breaks it down into way more energy. This is going to start with your carbon compounds and whatnot. You're going to take your that's unusual. You're going to take whatever's left over and you're going to break it all down. NADH, FADH, all this jazz, a bunch of different things. You're going to break all of them down. I don't need you to worry about the specific parts just yet. What I want you to know is that, first off, it takes place in the inner mitochondria. So this is the inner mitochondria. Okay, it's on the very, very inside. It's the last step on the very, very core of your mitochondria. The problem is, however, during this process, you're going to end up giving electrons all over the place. It's called the electron transport chain because it takes a bunch of electrons and moves them up and down, up and down. If you look on page 7, they've got a bunch of proteins embedded in the bilayer, and they're showing you how all of this changes. So you start off with NADH, and then you end up with NAD plus, and FADH, and FAD, and all this sounds really fancy and really complex, when really all it is it is a chain event of electrons, all right? Electrons, chaining up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, until eventually you end up with 34 ATP. Okay, well, 32 to 34, so I'm going to call it 32. Sorry about that. Oh my gosh. 32 ATP. That'll be the number, the magic number for our purposes. Alright, so 32 ATP from this entire process of energy production. Now, what's going to happen is, you know what, actually you don't need to go that far. I'm going to include most of this extra information in my final review, but I'm going to go over the general parts for now. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to page 8. This is, by the way, this is aerobic because oxygen has to be there at the very, very end. Oxygen at the end of everything. Gets electrons. Okay, so oxygen is going to get a bunch of electrons here. And that is pretty much why this entire process works. It's all based on getting everything down to where oxygen at the very, very end ends up with the electrons, and you're left with this ATP left over. And your body uses that ATP. That oxygen with electrons turns into carbon dioxide and a bunch of things, and then we breathe that out. But this is the big deal. 32 ATP, oxygen gets electrons. That's why it's called the electron transport chain. It's transporting all these electrons over just to get it over to oxygen. That is the main job. All right. So these are the key things that you need to know about ETC. It produces the most energy. It's aerobic. Why is it aerobic? Because it has to have oxygen receive electrons. If there's no oxygen, there's nothing to receive the electrons. There's no energy. All right. And then it occurs on the inner parts of the mitochondria. It's the very, very center of everything. So I'm going to skip these review questions. I'm going to move on to page 9. Just kidding. That's going to be another question. Alright, 10. Chemiosmosis. Now, chemiosmosis is a part of the electron transport chain, and it's a very, very specific part of all of this. Now, let me check to make sure, but I don't think that's going to show up in your mastery test. I'm not going to teach chemiosmosis here because, well, let me read over this real quickly. Uh, okay, so they do talk about a very, very general version of chemiosmosis, so I'm going to give you guys kind of a smaller idea. Chemiosmosis is part of the electron transport chain. It's really the process in which it extracts these electrons. But the idea behind chemiosmosis is this: it works with creating a proton gradient. Creating a proton gradient. It makes a charge, is all that means. It makes that inner mitochondrial area a different charge. And it's a positive charge, by the way. Because it's a positive charge, remember, positives attract electrons, so it moves the electrons across the chain until it finally gets onto oxygen. Uh, all of this is a really general way of saying this. I'm not going into specifics because you don't need it for your mastery test. I don't think you need it for your post test. And high school biology, as far as I know, never went that far. So I can't imagine the EOC covering FADH and all of that kind of thing. So chemiosmosis creates a proton gradient. So it makes the charge, that moves electrons, left to right, right to left, whichever way that mitochondria is. All right, and so what it does is it adds one phosphorus to each of its ADPs. And what happens when you add a phosphate to adenosine diphosphate? This results in adenosine triphosphate. So if I add one phosphate to diphosphate, three phosphates. So it's adenosine triphosphate. So this chemiosmosis process really just attaches phosphoruses onto ADPs, and then you get ATP. That's essentially what this does. All right. So this is the ETC as a whole. Hopefully this will make sense. It is a lot. All right. So feel free to pause this video if that didn't make sense. We're going to move on to page 11. Okay. So I'm going to move on to page 12. All right, they're going to talk about anaerobic respiration now. So what we've talked about so far, all this stuff, is pretty much going to be the aerobic version. So glycolysis to the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. All of that is as long as you have oxygen. However, sometimes you don't have oxygen. This is like when you're running or when you're swimming, or maybe you're just in space or in a tight space. Maybe you're doing, I don't know, you're in an airtight whatever. In any case, when you run out of oxygen, or some creatures live in areas with very, very low oxygen, you have to do something called anaerobic respiration. Now, anaerobic respiration is not really all that efficient. So you saw in the other one we got 30 something ATP. Well, anaerobic respiration is not as good. The basic example of this is yeast. Yeast does anaerobic respiration, and it produces what's called a lactic acid. So lactic acid is what causes you to cramp. So you can think of anaerobic respiration as the process that your body does to create energy when you're not breathing properly, when you don't have enough oxygen. So if you don't have enough oxygen, you start to cramp. If you breathe poorly, you cramp. That cramping is caused by lactic acid, which is produced by the cells when they're not getting enough air. All right. So in anaerobic respiration, you get something called fermentation. So let's talk about fermentation. All right, you guys have probably heard of fermentation. Fermentation is that process that people make like liquor. Out of grapes, you get wine. Out of certain wheats and that kind of thing, you can get beer or whiskey or other liquors. But the idea is fermentation is a process that we use in order to produce that lactic acid or produce that whatever it is. All right, so instead of being carried to the Krebs cycle, let me get this picture back. So instead of going to the Krebs cycle here in that second step, you can actually do something else. You end up doing this anaerobic respiration, and you're going to get fermentation here. All right, so let's talk about fermentation. Fermentation is going to be NADH, that thing that I mentioned to you earlier as a process of this second step, is going to be transferred into NAD+. And then this NAD+ moves back into glycolysis. And what glycolysis will do is it'll break down the NAD+ to get its 2 ATP. Alright? And once it has, well, technically it produces 4 ATP. Alright? And then it's going to, use up its energy, and you're going to end up going back over here to fermentation. And then you're going to ferment more stuff. Then you're going to do more NADH, you're going to do more NAD+, and it's going to cycle this way and that way. The one thing I do want you all to notice is that you end up with something called lactic acid, which we talked about earlier, lactic acid. So this is a result of not having enough oxygen. This is going to be really heavy in these kinds of situations. So this is the essential waste product. It's not really good for the body. So here is your waste product. All right. So that is fermentation from a really general view. Let's see, page 14 has two types of fermentation. All right. So now they're going to break down the two types that I mentioned a little while ago. There's going to be alcoholic fermentation and then lactic acid fermentation. All right. We talked about both of these. So one is with liquors, one is with cramps, and that kind of thing. So this one just takes pyruvate. Over here is going to take pyruvate. Remember pyruvate, this is a really, really important molecule, and it's going to show up for glycolysis and the second step like crazy. Like pyruvate is the main molecule in this process. So pyruvate is going to break down, and it's going to create, stuff for lactic acid, but I'm going to talk about the alcoholic side. What's going to happen is it's going to break down. You're going to get CO2. All right, and then you're going to get a bunch of NADHs, NADH, and NAD+. And then you end up with ethyl alcohol. All right, ethyl alcohol. And ethylene is an alcohol, and what you're going to do is you're just going to use that ethyl alcohol to make yourself wines or liquors or whatever else. All right, so that is a waste product. Simultaneously, you've also got on the other side of the equation, so this is all one process. This is all fermentation. You go the alcoholic side, and then you also create lactic acid. Okay, so you create 2 NADHs. You end up with some NAD+, 2 of these as well, and then you're going to get lactate, or lactic acid. Alright, so this is shown on page 14 there. It's just a process of fermentation. So just keep in mind, fermentation works like this. It's really just glycolysis over and over and over and over again. But you're using fermentation as a process to get this NADH, which is what you need to do this. So you're just going to keep using your pyruvate over and over and over again. Now, granted, if you run out of pyruvate, you can't produce energy, so you're probably going to die. So this is assuming that you've got pyruvate to deal with. All right? So there's alcohol, lactic fermentation, etc. Do make sure that you know the general process. You don't need to know each of these individual things. You just need to remember lactic fermentation ends up giving you lactic acid. Alcoholic fermentation ends up with ethylene or ethyl alcohol. All right? Page 15 is a question. So, just for the record, I told you guys lactic acid, this is cramping. So, if you guys look at page 15, you'll notice a question. It's about a racer that experiences pain in her leg muscles. So, you've been running, you need a lot of energy. What happened? You're probably breathing improperly, and you probably ended up with too much lactic acid because you went into fermentation and this process instead of going through the irregular electron transport chain. All right, so that was 15. Let's go to 16. Nope, 17. Okay, so 17 is going to be a really good page, and I highly recommend that you guys go over this. I know that you guys might not like tutorials, but it's really hard for me to make a video tutorial about this particular subject without it going forever. Like it takes a lot to to learn and understand what's actually going on. To just memorize it is okay. So like if you memorize the basic steps that I've laid out for you here, you'll probably be good. But if all you want to do is memorize, you could obviously just go to the tutorial, which gives you all the answers. To understand this is going to be a big part. So for anybody interested, feel free to message me, and I will help you understand this as best I can. All right. So cellular respiration is key. So yeah, they're going to give you all of these different magnifying glasses. I highly recommend them. I'm going to go ahead and move on to page 18. Alright, so page 17 on your tutorial is going to give you probably the greatest overview that you can get on all of this. Page 18 is a summary of everything, and page 19 is a question. I didn't really ask him. So on page 19, you guys will get a question asked. Where does chemiosmosis occur? Well, I told you guys that chemiosmosis is going to be part of the electron transport chain. I forgot I didn't mention this, but since it's part of the electron transport chain, you can assume that chemiosmosis also takes place in the inner mitochondria. All right. So if ETC takes place there, so does chemiosmosis. All right. So let's go ahead and do a summary for purposes of the mastery test. Just because that was a lot of information and I didn't even go in detail, I stuck with just a general idea. If you guys want the full detail, you can always message me, or you guys can go on page 17 and 18 of your tutorial, all right? Because they do a very good job at explaining the general ideas. But let's see what to highlight. So first off, remember all of your values. Glycolysis is only going to produce 2 ATP. It actually produces 4, but it uses 2 to start up, so you only end up with 2. The Krebs cycle only ends up with 2, and the electron transport chain ends up with 32. So this is your biggest one, and it's the most important one. Okay, so main thing to take away from this is all the little numbers, but also know that the ETC has the most. All right, this only happens in the presence of oxygen. So remember the difference between anaerobic and aerobic, and then definitely know your glycolysis produces just that 2. Alright, 2, and it uses NADH. The Krebs cycle produces all sorts of stuff, but it also only produces 2 ATP. Alright, so in the end, Krebs cycle is only 2 ATP. Now let's keep going. In the presence of oxygen, you can do what's called the ETC, or the electron transport chain. Alright, so it has the most energy. It is aerobic, as in it only happens in the presence of oxygen. It works in the inner mitochondria, so it is on the inside of the mitochondria. Alright, and then oxygen at the end of everything gets the electrons, so this is why it's called the electron transport chain. Oxygen ends up with the electrons. And then chemiosmosis is that process. You create a proton gradient by having a bunch of protons inside of your cell and not as many protons outside. That's what pulls the electrons in, and that's what allows you to attach it to oxygen. Okay, so that is a big deal. Oh yeah, and then anaerobic respiration was all that stuff about wine and cramping and whatnot. Just remember that this one only produces 2 ATP total, so it's that glycolysis, right? But glycolysis costs you 2 ATP. This only results in 2 ATP over and over again. Like I said, it is nowhere near as efficient as aerobic respiration is. Okay, that's why things that are anaerobic respirators, often like yeast or fungus or that kind of thing, they're often smaller and they don't move around. They don't do a whole lot. It's 99% because they don't have the energy to do that much. Now, I'm not saying if you were to give them much energy, they would suddenly become like living yeast or living gigantic bacteria or anything. But, you know, theoretically, that's probably how it would happen. So, lactic acid fermentation leads to cramping. Alcoholic is ethyl alcohol. This is what happens when you don't have oxygen. You have to keep recycling this NADH over and over and over just to produce this tiny bit of ATP. Your waste product is lactic acid and ethyl alcohol. You'll end up with both of these as your waste products. One of which, so ethyl alcohol, we use in wine making, liquor making in general, and then lactic acid we use. Well, we don't use it, but it's in like milk and whatnot, dairy products. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this actually turned out to be quicker than I thought, but as I was reading through it, I realized that they were going in a lot of detail, but I don't remember the mastery test looking like that. So hopefully this helps. Again, message me if you really want to understand this, because we can definitely talk about it. We probably have to do it in person, but we can talk about it until you understand. It is a really hard chapter, so do not stress if it doesn't make perfect sense. All right, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you need anything, and I'll see you guys next video.